Welcome to JMBE Live at the ASM Micro Meeting in 2023. I'm Stanley Malloy. I'm the editor-in-chief of JMBE, and I'm host today for a discussion we're going to have about teaching climate change. This is a really important problem because if we're ever going to solve the major issues affecting climate change, if we're going to ensure that we have a livable world 50 years from now, then we really need the public to understand climate change so that they'll support research on climate change and they'll help do their part to provide implementable solutions. And when we say everyone needs to be trained, I'm talking about K through 12, I'm talking about higher education, and we're talking about educating the public as well. For microbiologists, one of the key things that we see is that climate change is a broad interdisciplinary topic. Microbes, for example, generate greenhouse gases. They consume greenhouse gases. And microbes also, in the advent of climate change, can promote new diseases or worse diseases in humans, animals, and plants. And so today we have three guests with us who are all doing very different and interesting things to approach this idea of how you teach climate change effectively to different groups, right? And our guest today will start, Kelly Ramirez. Kelly's an assistant professor at the University of Texas, El Paso. Her research is focused on the soil microbiome and global climate change. And I'm going to add that in addition to her research on climate change, Kelly is really committed to making science more inclusive for women and marginalized communities, and she is the co-founder of 500 Women Scientists. Very important thing. Next is Zach Friedman. Zach is the O.N. Allen Professor of Soil Microbiology at the University of Wisconsin. And Zach works on ecosystem functions in the microbiome, and he is a leader of the Wisconsin Schoolyard Microbiome Project. And then finally, we have Arpita Bose. She is an associate professor of biology at Washington University in St. Louis. She does research on the role of microbes in biochemical cycling, and also she's played a leading role in starting a bachelor's degree program in climate change at the Arnad University in India, right? So three very different perspectives. And why don't we start with each of you and say, what have you done? What unique perspectives have you had that have allowed you to integrate climate change studies into education? Let's start with you.
All right, thanks, Stanley. Oh, that's a loaded question, or a tough question. What have I done? So I think I use, like we were talking about right before we started filming, my passion for microbes. And I try to convince every one of my students that microbes are the most important organism on the planet. And I start at a very early time. So organismal biology, they're freshmen. And I'm like, this is the most important. And I start that at that point. And I think my passion, they get interested right away. And so then it ties easily up to climate change because they're like, oh, this is an organism that's responsible for greenhouse gases that can consume them. Yeah, I think that's one.
Nice. How about you, Zach?
Yeah, so I guess, being we're at ASM, one unique kind of worldview that I bring into this is I found microbiology to be tremendously boring until I started my PhD. So the first microbiology class I ever took was in the first semester of my PhD program. So, I fully understand why one may not find microbes to be the most interesting organisms in the world. Now, of course, I completely disagree with that, but that's another story.
That's because you didn't have me as a teacher, I think.
That's what I'm saying, yeah, of course. And then before I was at UW-Madison, I was at West Virginia University, and there I taught both general microbiology that was geared towards juniors and seniors, and I also taught environmental microbiology that was mainly a senior level course. And had an overwhelmingly high amount of students that said, man, this is great. Like, why didn't I know about this earlier on in my program? I wish I was a microbiology major or a soil microbiology major. And so I think to reach students before that point is very important, which is one reason why I started the schoolyard microbiome project.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Schoolyard Microbiome Project now that you introduced it?
I would be happy to. So this is a project that's in its third year now. And we have recruited now upwards of 30 teachers from across the state of Wisconsin, and we work with the teachers and the students to sample soil beneath trees in their schoolyard. They send us that soil, we extract DNA and sequence the bacteria and the fungi from it, and then we try and express how certain decision making in terms of like reforestation, let's say, can influence the microbes that you would have in your systems and what functional consequences there may be to that decision making.
And Arpita, tell us your story.
Yeah, so I was actually the opposite of Zach. I loved microbes. And the reason why I loved them was because I couldn't see them. And you needed a special microscope to see these organisms. It was spectacular. It was like, I felt like a crazy scientist in ninth grade doing that. So I think that to me, that also showcases that you have to capture the imagination of children very early on, because microorganisms are so important, even with pandemics, with diseases that spread. A lot of times I have an 8-year-old daughter and I see what she does. I see like her just like touching everything and getting sick all the time. And it occurs to me that, she doesn't have basic understanding of microorganisms because they're invisible. And I keep telling her that I'm a microbiologist, they're everywhere. And, initially she might get freaked out by it a little bit. But then I'm like, no, they're good ones. Mostly they're good. They're doing all these awesome things for you. And then I think that, children can understand that from an early age. So I believe that starting early is good, and that's why I'm trying to engage students at earlier stages in microbiology understanding and trying to write books about it as well.
Could you say something about your collaboration with India to develop this bachelor's program?
Yeah, that's been fascinating. So I got very interested in climate change during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I realized that there were all these climate changes that were happening. I was trying to find an avenue to talk to people who were non-scientists, and I found this fellowship. It was called the Anant Fellowship for Climate Action. And I applied, and I was like, you know what, I'll probably not make it because they're looking for social scientists. But they actually shortlisted me, and there were about 3,000 international applicants. So I was like very surprised that, a microbiologist stands out. But then I took it for a year, and what spurred out of it was this whole climate action school that's called the Anant School for Climate Action. And here they started a bachelor's in climate technologies, and it was based on the idea that from the World Economic Forum, there was an assessment done that climate change is going to create a multiple trillion dollar industry, and we actually don't have people to work in it. And one of the countries with the highest populations and the lowest number of students or people trained to tackle climate problems was India, which only has about 5,000 people trained to deal with that. And so it was obvious that I had to contribute. And when they asked, I immediately agreed. We are in the second semester, we just wrapped up. And these students are learning things like microbiology and global finance. So you can see there's like a huge variety of topics. And I'm really in awe of the students, and I'm also a little jealous that I wish I was taking this BTech instead of, just teaching them something. So it's very exciting.
That's great. So Kelly, back to you. One of the challenges with teaching climate change is there is a lot of misinformation out there. By the time students get to college, they've already got some of that. There's a lot of politics involved in climate change. And sometimes when you try to integrate something new into the curriculum that's already so packed, it's kind of hard. What challenges have you met, and how have you overcome them?
That's a great question. I think what I have done is, when I introduce climate change, I talk a lot about what's going on in our local community. In El Paso, the Rio only runs 1 to 2 months of the year, right? It's all being funneled to agriculture north of us. And it used to be a wetland. And my students can tell, like, they know what climate change is. It's 5 degrees hotter now than it was 20 years ago. Soils are eroding away as more development happens. We have these increasing large dust storms. And so they see it on a daily basis. And I talk about the processes of climate change and say, like, what have you noticed in your community? What have you talked about in your community? And then it is really, so it's science, politics, and there's also an activism component to climate change, right? And I challenge them to think about it from different angles and put themselves in different positions. If you had to convince a policymaker to make a change for our community, how would you convince them? Or if you were working for USGS and you had a new report on the Rio Grande, what social media campaign would you do to share with the community, right? How would you convince the community that we needed to use less water, for example? So giving them the examples that they don't have to just learn about it, that they can be involved in having an impact on reducing climate change, I think gives them, they have more power then. They feel like they have agency. And I think that's really important to change that narrative, that they're not just having to learn something and like just accept that climate change is their future, right? And they're going to be our leaders in the next 50 years, right?
Yeah, that's great. So Arpita, it sounds like in India at least, you walked into a different situation where they were already in tune to the need for teaching climate change.
Yeah, that was, like I mentioned, when I was looking for the Climate Action Fellowship, this was the only one that came up. And we had an introductory class by artists who were, the provost of the institute was actually a prolific artist. And he had this beautiful conversation about climate change with us. And it was entirely positive. And that was so refreshing, thinking about it as a way where you can actually make a positive impact through a variety of things we could do. And along the lines of what you were just talking about, in my class on microbiology that I teach, I ask the students to do a little essay. It's a free format essay on what they care about and sustainability. And I collate those essays. It's a class of about 100 students. And I sort of ask them, what topic are you talking about? And it goes from fashion to art. And these are microbiology majors. They're talking about topics that are so diverse and where they fit in sustainability and how it impacts our climate. And it's all positive. And I feel like climate change has this very negative connotation in some ways, like, how do I contribute? I'm so overwhelmed by it. But I think that in India, at least through the Anand Fellowship, I met people from all over the world. It was a global fellowship, and we all had a blast, and it was all positive. And the new students that we talked to, it's all positive. So India is approaching this in a very positive way, which to me was very refreshing.
And Zach, this idea of going into the schoolyards, you're really interacting with a very different group, convincing them to think about microbiomes and thinking about soil ecology in a way most kids of that age probably don't, unless they happen to have a parent who's a microbiologist, they're probably not thinking about it all.
Well, certainly, and that touches on a theme that is being built, by our group here. That I think it's important with climate change education not to scare, to move away from scaring. And I think it's especially important with students nowadays. These are students who go through active shooter drills at school. They went through the COVID pandemic. They're scared already. They don't need to be scared by climate change. So I think to focus more on how to empower the students to critically think through solutions to climate change, of which microbes can play a governing role. So, like, one example of this project that I had ongoing from my time in West Virginia was about how to best manage former surface mine lands to be of some kind of ecological integrity. And so a project that I asked students to do is to come up with some kind of plan to either culture a microbial consortium or certain beneficial microbes that we can then apply to these damaged soils as biofertilizers or to bio-augment them. And then before you know it, they're coming up with these very elegant protocols to derive these beneficial microbial consortia for good. And students were super into it. So I think empowering the students for good through a climate change lens, I think, is very important.
And what about the teachers? Do you find, is this a select group of teachers who already appreciate the importance of climate change, or are you reaching out broadly to teachers?
Oh boy, we reached out incredibly broadly to teachers. And the first year we tried this schoolyard microbiome program was 2020, in the fall of 2020. So right in the early days of COVID. And so, bless the teachers that contributed to the first year of our program, because they had a lot on their plate. To build relationships was difficult, and to engage schools that were outside of the population centers of the state was also quite difficult. And I have a wonderful lab manager who is the child of a teacher. And so, having somebody with her perspective is just tremendously helpful. And for her being able to just, let me call my mom and ask her about this, that we're able to, right away be sure that we're at least starting this program in a way that will benefit the teachers. So it's more of a two-way interaction, really a three-way interaction between us, the teachers, and the students, versus more of a, this is what we think is important, and here's some material. And, so to incorporate the teachers and the students from the start has been great.
I don't know if you've seen this, but the New York Times this morning reported that New Jersey is requiring climate change education at every level from kindergarten through 12th grade.
First state to do
that. First state to do that. And so that's going to be a big, grand experiment that I think we're going to learn a lot from in the next few years. So it's very exciting. Right. But it took a very progressive governor's wife to make it happen. So one of the things, though, that when you're thinking about education like this, if you want to expand a program, it's really important not just that people like it, but you can show it has an impact, right? So I'd like to have the perspective from each of you about how you measure impact, if you have yet, or how you think you can measure it for each one of these programs that you've talked about. And we'll start again with you, Kelly.
So measuring impact, I would then ask, which areas do we want to measure impact in? Do we want to measure impact in our students and how they're retaining the information and using it in their own personal life? And I wanted to comment really quickly about this positive, negative of climate change. And I think what I was thinking about is our students feel guilt that they should be doing something for climate change. Are they recycling enough? Are they biking enough and not driving, right? And I think one component of learning about climate change that we can take from the climate justice community is that this is not something an individual can just solve on their own. It's a community that needs to solve it, and they don't need to put on that mental pressure on themselves. It really gets you down, honestly, if you are sitting around for a while thinking about it, right? And we don't want our students to take on that guilt and feel like they have to do everything on their own, right? And at the same time, that if their community is threatened, that we aren't leaving those communities behind. So that it's not I think it's more than negative and positive. It's what are we doing to bring those communities with us and help take the burden off of an individual and put it on the community. So I just wanted to add that before going on.
Can I just follow up with
Yeah.
that? So one of the things I've done over the last 10 years is talk to a lot of community groups about climate change, right? Non-scientists. And one of the things, in the last couple of years, I think there's this broader acceptance that climate change is really affecting us now, right? Before that, extreme weather, you could say, how do you know that that's really climate change? And so people would say, how's it affecting me now, right? It's going to cost me now, and it's going to be 50 years. I'm going to be dead by the time it's an issue, right? And so one of the things that I found was talking about microbes and their ability to cause disease at small intervals of temperature change. For example, Vibrio in cold seawater, where a 1.5 degree change can distinguish disease and not. You can talk to somebody who knows nothing about Vibrio, nothing about the disease, but this idea that that small change that has already happened is enough to affect people's lives makes them say this is important. So you could say you're promoting one of the bad things climate change does, but it's also promoting a reality of it happening, right?
Yeah.
So I think I agree with all of you. It's very tough to balance, but I don't think you can neglect the negative.
For sure.
No, I think that I didn't mean to imply that we should ignore the negative, but especially to engage youth. I think that I felt that that was helpful. But of course, they already hear a lot of these kinds of things, you know. So they have information way more than we did when we were their age, right? So a lot of information is out there. A lot of it is negative, and I think that there's this balance and offset.
Yeah,
right?
I think you're totally right. They do have a lot of information already, and so when I get students, they of course they're like, yeah, I know what climate change is, but they don't know the inner workings, like the conceptual model of the microbial carbon cycle and how that fits into climate change. And I think having those intimate knowledge with the microbial processes, whether it's a carbon cycle or disease, like warming and more mosquitoes and more malaria, right? Like those sorts of processes allow them to then have that agency that we've been talking about. And like they're already, all the information is out there. It's like helping put it together for them.
Yeah, I think the UN has made a huge effort in creating information packages that they, are engaged. So I use a lot of material for my classes that I get from the UN actually, and it's very balanced, but it paints a very clear picture, and it's clear that you have to do something about it. And I feel like engaging students, young or younger or youth, in solutions like Zach was talking about, is where I have been sort of working on. But knowledge is important, right? Even negative knowledge is important, right?
Let me just add, this morning Arpita gave a talk of the research in her lab that's specifically working on being able to use microbes in a positive way to respond to climate challenges. And so it's a wonderful example of how you can do something positive, not just focus on negative. So.
And remarkably, I can somehow explain it to my 8-year-old as to what I do because she understands it. She has the information as a young child. So.
All right, back
Okay.
to how you measure
How do we
it.
quantify? So do we quantify are we changing their mindset? Are we having an impact on the community? Are we figuring out ways to store more carbon because they become researchers who now understand microbes and can work and can figure out inoculations in our soil, and our soils now store all the carbon we needed and climate change is solved, right? Like that's like what part do we want to measure? And I think that's really hard. I think for me, since I've only been at my position a couple of years, it's getting requests from my students for reference letters to go on to graduate school or jobs that are with environmental agencies. So seeing that they're going on to continue thinking about climate change or other global change pressures in their career, that's currently where I'm at. I guess El Paso just tried to pass a climate charter. And I think a lot of my students were involved in that. It was a lot of young people. It did not pass, but it was really awesome to see the community doing that. So I think that's another measurement, seeing those sorts of a climate charter on your ballot. Yeah.
Nice. So Zach, what about you?
Yeah, so measurement assessment is super important. I guess two things I think about. So one, like at Wisconsin, I teach Environmental Studies 101, and part of that class, every week students have to do a personal challenge where they challenge themselves to live in a more environmentally friendly way and then reflect on it. And so at the end of the semester, I ask students through a casual course evaluation whether they think their decision-making beyond this semester will be impacted by these personal challenges. And on those assessments, overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. But what I would like to do is see in future years if that change in decision-making persists, which I haven't found a way to do that yet, but it's a goal of mine. Related to the schoolyard microbiome project, really the goal there is to try and change decision making for students when they think about eventual college majors. So I would love to convince people to become microbiology majors or soil science majors. And we have a roster of students who have contributed to the schoolyard microbiome program, and my plan is to reach out to them in their senior year of college to ask questions about, or senior year of high school, excuse me, to see if what they learned changed their thinking in a way that ultimately affected their decision making.
Very nice. And Arpita.
Yeah, so for assessment, for my course that I was asking them to write the essay about, they themselves assessed the essay without me even having a survey question that year. And they said that was their favorite thing. Like almost unanimously, it was like, that was our favorite thing to do because it made us think about our practices, our habits, and such. And for the BTech course, they are really enjoying microbiology, which was very amazing because they're learning so many different topics. And I would ask them in class, so are you enjoying microbiology? Do you think microbes can find, you can find ways of using them in technologies? And they wanted to learn more. Some of them wanted to learn enzymology. And the next course was global finance. So you can see that, we can make an impact. It's a young course, so we don't know yet but I'll keep assessing them in class. So there's both the surveys and in-class assessments that I've been doing.
Thanks very much. We're getting near the end, but I want to say that these are 3 different perspectives on ways you can integrate teaching climate change at a whole slew of different levels, right? And in a way that can potentially change people's thinking, that if we could do that across society, we'd be in a very different place. And solving climate change is going to require that kind of broad perspective and social responsibility. I was at a session earlier this morning, and I was thinking, is there another big kind of event like this that society has responded to, that we've been able to really change the world for the better? And immediately, I thought of our response to acid rain, and the speaker said, most people weren't even born when acid rain was a problem. So, but it is a great example. It's a very important, serious example of how society, in many different ways, from voters to politicians to students, can make the world a better place, importantly. So JMBE, the Journal for Microbiology and Biology Education, is going to have a special series on teaching climate change. And that special series will uncover a whole series of different kinds of ways that you may think about teaching climate change. And we'd really like to invite any of you who teaches, who brings climate change into your classroom, to submit an article. The way we're going to do this most effectively is going to learn from each other. Every time you hear someone else talk about a new way of doing it, it may stimulate us to all find better ways we can reach out to different audiences. So please consider submitting a paper to JMBE. The deadline for this special issue is November, so there's still time to do research and write the paper. And we look forward to seeing you make submissions. Thank you very much.